Thank you, Esther, so much for this wonderful opportunity. When you contacted me and I began thinking about this class, I realized very quickly that this would be a new experience for me. I think this is going a little bit out of my comfort zone. Many of my classes are much more Torah content based, and this one will be as well. But at the same time, the topic is a topic that I want to develop beyond the Torah sources, and I don't get to do lectures like this very often, and so I really appreciate this opportunity to broaden my horizons and to speak on topics more in depth than I normally would here in the work that I do at Avas Torah here in Englewood. As Esther mentioned, I will definitely keep an eye on the chat section of Zoom. If anybody wants to post any questions there, I'll keep an eye on that. And if anybody's not comfortable putting questions in the chat, you can save them till the end, and we'll leave some time at the end for those questions. So today's talk is on grief and grieving. And when we talk about grief, what we mean specifically are the feelings of deep sorrow that we experience over a loss. And the reason why this is such a relevant topic, it's relevant every single day of the year, and people experience loss in various forms all the time, unfortunately. But clearly there's a feeling now that it's more acutely relevant during the time of this pandemic. Being in the midst of a pandemic, we're more exposed to loss. I'll just throw out a few numbers at you that I looked up yesterday in terms of how many people have been sick to one degree or another, and how many people unfortunately have passed away. Here in Bergen County alone, it's over 19,600 confirmed cases of COVID, 1,983 as of yesterday confirmed deaths. Just in Bergen County, 173,000 cases in New Jersey, almost 15,000 deaths in New Jersey alone. 2.6 million confirmed cases in the United States, 128,000 confirmed deaths as of yesterday. And worldwide, I'm sure many of you saw in the news that we passed the 10 million mark. More than 10 million people have been affected by COVID. Over 500,000 people have died in this world from COVID, and these are very stark numbers, and these are numbers that we're really not accustomed to. But when we have a conversation about grief, the sorrow that we feel over loss, it's important though that we broaden the definition of grief, we broaden really the definition of loss, I should say, because I would say there are many kinds of losses, but I would group them into two categories. There's the loss of a loved one, very obvious sense of what it means to lose, but there's also loss that we experience in the context of our lives that we also feel grief over. The loss of normalcy, the loss of certainty, the loss of a job, which has a profound impact on a person. The loss of a relationship, the loss of the normal contact that we have with family or the relationships that we have. There's economic loss. It could be someone we know that we care about who is experiencing loss. These are all different forms of loss over which we experience grief. So we're going to be talking about loss in the broad category, but please understand that when I talk about loss, I'm talking about two different things. Either the loss of a loved one or the other senses of loss that we experience in our lives. Now, when we look to our tradition, when we look to our national heritage for examples, for biblical figures who have to reckon with loss, there are many to choose from. As common as loss is today, so it was in the ancient period. But there's one character to me that stands out as with regards to expressions of grief. Many characters in the Torah experience grief. There's one character in particular who expresses his grief more than any other, and that is the biblical character of Joseph. Yosef, if you look in the Torah, cries 6 times. And it may not necessarily be a loss at each one of those times, but each time Yosef is crying, I believe he's expressing his sense of grief. And I just want to pause for a moment to talk about what crying really means in the context of grief, because we cry in all sorts of different circumstances. We cry, we cry over sadness. We cry when we're laughing. We cry, just when we feel emotions intimately. But there's a great quote I saw a long time ago from Carl Sandburg, the great American poet. He was in Chicago, where I hail from, so obviously he holds a special place in my heart. But Carl Sandburg had a great quote. He says, he observed that life is like an onion. You peel it off one layer at a time, and sometimes you weep. And this observation of his comparing life to an onion it's not just, because we cry when we peel onions. What he's saying is that the more you peel off layers, the more a person gets in touch with their own self, the more likely they are to experience something deep within themselves that inspires them to weep, to cry. Now, when it comes to Joseph, I'm not going to review all 6 instances in which he cries, but I'd like to focus on 2 of them that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, because it's so fascinating how and when Joseph cries. And I'm just going to share my screen for a moment. I'm just going to pause and just bring it up here, because I'm not so good at doing 2 things at once. But here we have, I'm just going to do it in the English. I didn't do it in the Hebrew. But here we have one of the instances in which Joseph cries. When Joseph is down in Egypt and becomes viceroy to Pharaoh, so we know that he's in charge of supplying food to the entire region during the terrible famine, and Jacob sends his sons down to go get food for the family, and they meet this person that they don't know is Joseph, and Joseph sends them back to bring their other brother that they hadn't brought the first time, the brother Benjamin, who is Joseph's brother from Rachel. And when the brothers come down a second time and they bring Benjamin, so here in the verse it says, he lifted his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and he said, "Is this your youngest brother whom you mentioned to me that you would bring here?" He, Joseph, then said, "God be gracious to you, my son." And in the next verse, verse 30, Joseph hurried because his mercy was aroused toward his brother, whom he had not seen for many years, and he sought to weep. Joseph wanted to cry. Therefore, he quickly entered the chamber, his private room, and he wept there. He washed his face to hide the fact that he had been weeping, and emerged, and he restrained himself. He held it in. He still felt that he wanted to cry when he was back in the presence of his brothers, but he didn't. He restrained himself and said to his attendants, "Serve bread." So here we see that Joseph wants to cry, but he doesn't want to cry in front of his brothers. The simple reason why he doesn't want to cry is very clear. He doesn't want to cry because he doesn't want to reveal his true identity to his brothers. That's perfectly understandable. But what's interesting, though, is that there is a second time in which Joseph cries in relation to his brothers, because after Joseph threatens to hold on to Benjamin and to not let him go back, we know that Judah makes this very heartfelt appeal to this person who he finds out is Joseph, and in this appeal, Judah, asks the viceroy Joseph to take him instead, and then finally Joseph can't take it anymore, and he has the urge to cry again, and so he asks that the room be cleared. And I'll read the verses in chapter 45, verse 1. Joseph could not restrain from revealing himself, but he nevertheless held back before all those standing before him so as not to embarrass his brothers. and he called, "Remove every man from before me." No other man stood with him when Joseph revealed himself to his brothers. And then in verse 2, it says, he raised his voice in weeping. And then the Egyptians heard, and the house of Pharaoh heard. And then in the next verse, Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph." Now, something very interesting just happened here, and it's easy to miss. Because here, Joseph is ready to reveal himself to his brothers, and he wants to cry, and he removes everyone from the room. It's just him and his brothers. And you would think, if you weren't reading the verses, you would think it's going to say that Joseph blurts out, "I am Joseph, I am your brother," and then start crying. But that's not what happens. Instead, Joseph clears the room and he starts to cry. He's crying in front of his brothers, but his brothers don't know who he is yet. He's crying. But question is, why is he crying? He cries, and then, but not only that, he cries, and the whole house of Pharaoh hears his crying even before Joseph has said, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" It's a remarkable thing that's easy to miss, every time we read this story, that Joseph begins crying before he reveals himself. And what that says to me is that clearly Joseph was confronted by something. He was seized by something before he revealed his identity. And that his crying before, that he didn't want to do in front of his brothers, and the crying now had to do with something that he had to reckon with before he revealed his identity. We could say it's just the emotion of the moment, but I firmly believe there is a deeper reason here. And that is that Joseph had to come to terms with his own grief, his own estrangement from his family, before he could reunite with them. The moment before he takes that step and tells his brothers who he is, he pauses for a moment to think about those many years that they were separated, those many lost years. And he feels the grief over all of that lost time and how it's about to come to an end. All of that lost time in which he doesn't even know, or perhaps he does and he's pretending, but he's not even sure if his own father is alive or if his father even cares about him. He pauses for a moment before he reveals his identity, and he reckons with that loss, that estrangement, that disconnection. And that's why he cries before revealing himself, not after. And what's fascinating is that earlier on in the story, when Joseph is firmly entrenched in Egypt, I don't have the source here for you, so I'm just gonna convey the idea outside. But when Joseph becomes firmly established in Egypt, he has two sons, and he names his sons in the most strange fashion. He names his sons' names are Menashe and Ephraim, and he declares why he named his first son Menashe. And the reason he gives is that God has made me forget all of my suffering, all of the trouble that I experienced in my father's house. What a strange way to name a child. He names a child over the fact that Hashem has made him, that God has made him forget all of his suffering in the past. And his son Ephraim is named because he says that God has made me fruitful, has made me productive in the land of my affliction. And so clearly, Joseph, in naming his two children, is establishing a separation from his suffering at home and how it brought him to this strange land. So here, in the midst of Joseph's life in Egypt, he wants to forget. He wants to forget all the suffering. He wants to put it aside. He doesn't want to sit with those uncomfortable feelings, that discomfort of having been abandoned and sold off by his family. And so in naming his children, he willfully casts aside that entire experience. And then when his brothers show up, and he's ready to reveal himself. He's ready to reconnect with the people that he had previously forgotten on purpose, previously detached from. He sits for a moment to experience that grief, that sense of loss, how much they lost before they then reconnect. Joseph is moving at this moment from a place of avoidance to a place of acceptance and re-engagement and reconnection. And he is crying not tears of happiness, not tears simply of emotion at the gravity of the moment, but rather he's re-engaging the pain, the grief of his past, of his own estrangement. Now, this idea of grief and really embracing that a person embraces their sense of grief that they're experiencing, a great deal of study has been done in the last several decades on these feelings and how people cope or process feelings of grief. In fact, when we talk about grief and grieving, we're already hinting to the title of a book written by a very, very important scholar on loss and grieving. She passed away a number of years ago. Her name is Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and she wrote a book together with David Kessler, who's also a scholar on death and dying, and they called their book On Grief and Grieving. Now, this book on grief and grieving, which I have right here, this book on grief and grieving is a follow-up to a more popular, more well-known book that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote called On Death and Dying. It was a groundbreaking book. She wrote On Death and Dying. It was first published in 1969, and it was quickly recognized as a groundbreaking work. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the central thesis of that work On Death and Dying, even if you haven't even heard of the book. Because in this book, On Death and Dying, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross develops what is famously known as the 5 stages of death. In studying people who go through the dying process, she identified 5 stages that people go through, terminally ill people. There's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And the whole concept of these 5 stages postulates, and I'm quoting from an article, postulates a series of emotions experienced by terminally ill patients prior to death, or people who have lost a loved one. And okay, all right. I'm gonna go back and forth from the sharing. Here we go. Okay, thank you. All right, so people. So the 5 stages are experienced by people going through this process. Now, after these ideas made such a splash that there was sort of like I wouldn't say a backlash, but there was a great deal of criticism also because they became so quickly accepted and recognized, and these 5 stages really resonated with people. And the criticism that these five stages received was that there wasn't a lot of empirical evidence to back that up. It was hard to study and trace the stages people go through. But the problem was, for those who criticized, for those who critiqued the 5 stages of death, they mistakenly believed that this was a specific order in which people grieve and that all people go through these stages. That's not what she meant. What she meant is that these stages, they're not linear, and some people may not experience all of them or any of them, yet others might undergo, just 2 of the stages or 3 of the stages, not all of them. And it's now more readily known that these 5 stages of grief are the most commonly observed, experienced by the grieving population. In other words, the 5 stages were not meant to define or classify anybody or their feelings. They are tools by which we can identify all sorts of different reactions that people have during these experiences. So she wrote that book first in 1969. It was published many, many times. And then in the beginning of the 2000s, David Kessler began working with Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross on a follow-up book, a follow-up to On Death and Dying. And this follow-up book was called On Grief and Grieving. And the transition from On Death and Dying to the new book On Grief and Grieving was the recognition that these 5 stages of grief were experienced not just by people who were dying, or people people who know someone who's dying, but that these stages can help identify the grief that people feel for other kinds of loss. Like I mentioned at the beginning of our talk, we can feel grief. We can feel a sense of loss over many different terrible experiences that we undergo, aside from death. The loss of a job, the loss of normalcy, the loss of certainty, the loss of predictability in life that many of us are experiencing right now. And so in the book On Grief and Grieving, she actually addresses the critiques to the On Death and Dying book. And so I'm going to reshare my screen because I just want to read with you just a little bit because I think it'll be helpful. Here we go. The 5 stages of grief. So this is at the beginning of On Grief and Grieving. The stages have evolved since their introduction, and they have been very misunderstood over the past 3 decades. They were never meant to help tuck messy emotions into neat packages. They are responses to loss that many people have, but there is not a typical response to loss, as there is no typical loss. Our grief is as individual as our lives. The 5 stages, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, are a part of the framework that makes up our learning to live with the one we lost. They are tools to help us frame and identify what we may be feeling, but they are not stops on some linear timeline in grief. Not everyone goes through all of them or goes in a prescribed order. Our hope, that's Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler, our hope is that with these stages comes the knowledge of grief's terrain, making us better equipped to cope with life and loss. So it's very clear. This sets out very clearly what the stages of grief are and what they aren't. And I just want to read a couple other quotes that I'm not going to put them on the screen. I'm just going to read them to you because they're somewhat brief, that help us to understand what it means to experience the different stages of grief when we experience any kind of loss. One quote that I found very meaningful from this book is, people often think of the stages as lasting weeks or months. They forget that the stages are responses to feelings that can last for minutes or hours as we flip in and out of one and then another. We do not enter and leave each individual stage in linear fashion. We may feel one, then another, and back again to the first one. And there's something very profound that they write when it comes to depression. That's the 4th stage, but again, they're not linear. But in the stage of depression, there's an insight here that I think is important for grief in general, specifically for our talk here this afternoon. They write in their book as follows: if grief is a process of healing, depression is one of the many necessary steps along the way. And I'm gonna frame what she means by depression in a moment. If you have the awareness to recognize you are in a depression, or have been told by multiple friends you are depressed, your first response may be to resist and look for a way out. Seeking a way out of depression feels like going into a hurricane and sailing around the inside perimeter, fearful that there is no exit door. As tough as it is, depression can be dealt with in a paradoxical way. Here, this is very important what she writes. See it as a visitor, perhaps an unwelcome one, but one who is visiting whether you like it or not. Make a place for your guest. Invite your depression to pull up a chair with you in front of the fire and sit with it without looking for a way to escape. Allow the sadness and emptiness to cleanse you and help you explore your loss in its entirety. When you allow yourself to experience depression, it will leave you as soon as it has served its purpose in your loss. As you grow stronger, it may return from time to time, but that is how grief works. Now, this is what they write in their book, and they put out there a very important caveat, which is clinical depression needs serious treatment. And when one's depression begins to get in the way of living their life and thriving, person absolutely needs treatment. But when we talk about depression that is not clinical, but the more common forms of depression that we feel over loss, when we're in a state of grief, what's so important here about what she writes is how the feelings of sadness and depression need to be welcomed in like an uninvited guest. And they need to be reckoned with and sat with and thought about, meditated upon. They cannot, the more a person tries to push them away, the bigger they get. I want to share another quote that she writes in her book, or they both, she and the other guy. As difficult as it is to endure, depression has elements that can be helpful in grief. Listen to this. It slows us down and allows us to take real stock of the loss. It makes us rebuild ourselves from the ground up. It clears the deck for growth. It takes us to a deeper place in our soul that we would not normally explore. That's why I wrote in the title, The Only Way Around is Through. The only way around feelings of grief, the only way to get through feelings of grief is to go through them, is to acknowledge them and appreciate them and sit and meditate upon them. And that's what I believe Joseph is doing in that moment when he cries before revealing himself. He's taking a moment to sit with the terrible grief of the over 20 years in which he was abandoned by his family, a family that he suffered with when he used to live with them. And this whole concept of being able to sit with something, I think it resonates very well, particularly with those in the Jewish community, because all of us are familiar with the Jewish rituals of mourning, right? The mourning process, which reflects so beautifully this concept of being able to sit with difficult feelings instead of pushing them away. Because the stages in the mourning process impose a structure upon a mourner, preventing a mourner from moving on without at least having the opportunity to confront those feelings. The Shiva, the 7 days of mourning in which a mourner stays in their house and everyone else comes to them, what's called the Shloshim, the 30-day period, the year, the Yortzeit. This is an imposed time frame that compels a person to at least make the time to confront the feelings that they are experiencing. And it's true not just for the loss of a person, but it's true for any sort of loss that anyone experiences and the grief that they feel over that. To impose a certain sense of structure, the whole notion of sitting down with a therapist, which is such a wonderful opportunity for so many people, is a way to impose a structure on oneself and to take an hour a week or 2 hours or an hour every month, whatever it is, but to sit with someone and force yourself to speak out loud with someone the feelings of grief that a person has is a reflection of that concept of staying in it, embracing it, going through it, not around it, and really truly reckoning with grief. So that's an insight that comes from the realm from the stage of depression, of the 5 stages. The 5th stage that they identify is acceptance. And there's something very important with acceptance that we can learn from this stage, but we have to understand what it is and what it isn't, because acceptance doesn't mean that we're okay with the loss, that we understand it and we're fine with it. No, a loss is a loss, and a loss is something that is not positive, and a loss is something that very often cannot be undone or the experience of the loss cannot be undone. But what does it mean? What does acceptance mean? Acceptance means that we've gotten to a place in our minds and our hearts where we can function and thrive even with that sense of loss, even with that visitor in our lives. It's to thrive with the sense of loss, not despite the sense of loss. And what's so interesting is that this scholar, David Kessler, who worked with Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, and she passed away right around the time that they were finishing on Grief and Grieving, the book that I've been quoting from. He, in his work after her death, went on to develop a 6th stage in grief and grieving. And that 6th stage after acceptance is finding meaning in loss. Now, again, this is something we have to be very careful with, because finding meaning does not mean understanding why a loss occurred. No one should ever listen to anyone tell them, oh, God is punishing you. This is why you experienced this loss. It's your own fault. Those are very difficult things to hear, and they're wrong and they're not true. And so what he talks about when he says finding meaning, what he's talking about is not finding a reason why these things are happening, but rather being able to reckon with whatever lessons a person can derive from the experience, whatever new insight or appreciation into a relationship or into life that one can find out of that experience, to be able to give meaning to that loss helps a person. It doesn't take what he wrote in what he said in a podcast that I listened to of his, is that it doesn't take away the pain of the loss, but it gives a cushion to the loss. And he gets this idea from someone which I'm sure many of us are familiar with, and that is the work of Dr. Viktor Frankl. Many of us are familiar with Viktor Frankl, the founder of logotherapy. It's a form of psychotherapy that he developed after surviving Nazi concentration camps in the 40s. After his experience in the camps, he went on to develop a theory that it is through the search for meaning and purpose in life that individuals can endure hardship and suffering. That one way to reckon, or one way to just deal and survive one's suffering, is to find purpose, is to find meaning. Frankl came from a position that all human beings, to one degree or another, are motivated by something called a will to meaning. We are meaning-seeking individuals. And he argued that life can have meaning even in the most miserable of circumstances, and that the motivation for living comes from finding that meaning. And so drawing upon the work of Viktor Frankl, what David Kessler argues is that perhaps a 6th stage to grief can be finding meaning within that grief. I just want to put up on the screen for you one excerpt from Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, because it has such a powerful quote in it, which I think will connect back to our Joseph story as well. So I'm going to share my screen again, and here we go. So he's talking about suffering, and I don't want to go through the whole thing, the whole paragraph. But you'll see in the first sentence he writes, once the meaning of suffering had been revealed to us, we refused to minimize or alleviate the camp's tortures by ignoring them or harboring false illusions and entertaining artificial optimism. Do me a favor, skip down to the highlight. But there was, and just go two or three lines before the highlight. There was plenty of suffering for us to get through. Therefore, it was necessary to face up to the full amount of suffering, trying to keep moments of weakness and furtive tears to a minimum. But, here's the highlight, but there was no need to be ashamed of tears, for tears bore witness that a man had the greatest of courage, the courage to suffer. Only very few realized that. Shamefacedly, some confessed occasionally that they had wept, like the comrade who answered my question of how he had gotten over his edema by confessing, I have wept it out of my system. But what Viktor Frankl is saying here is that the courage to suffer means the courage to confront what is going on and be able to feel and experience that grief. The reason it takes courage is because it's so easy. It's a real defense mechanism for us to just put aside our grief, not even think about it, distract ourselves, do things to numb ourselves to the pain and to the grief. The courage to suffer means the willingness to confront grief and embrace it and think about it and meditate upon it and talk to people about it. And so I believe that he's referring to that, I connect it to that moment that Joseph was willing to cry before he revealed himself to his brothers. He had the courage to think about the past 20 years of estrangement and the pain that it caused him. He was willing to embrace it for a moment so that he could then wholeheartedly begin to re-embrace his brothers. He was integrating that awful experience into his life. You know, this reminds me of a famous song, which also happens to be a verse in the Torah. There's a very famous song from the 60s. The folk rock band, the Byrds, had a song that everyone knows, the song Turn, 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 right? To everything, turn, 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 right? So we all know that song is based on verses in Ecclesiastes, Psukim in Koheles, and the verses in Koheles and Ecclesiastes talk about how there's a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot, a time to kill, a time to heal. And most importantly for our discussion, what it says there is eight livkot ve'eight lischot. There is a time to cry and there's a time to rejoice. Eight sifo, there's a time to mourn, ve'eight rakot, and there's a time to dance. And what that means, and it's not saying that like, okay, there's a time to cry and then there's a time to laugh, meaning, okay, you have one moment to cry and then you have one moment to laugh and then you have a moment to do this and do that. No, life is filled with these moments, and these moments come at different times. But it's not just an observation that these moments come. It's not descriptive, it's proscriptive. Make a moment, create a moment, allow yourself to have a moment of crying. Devote a time to crying, devote time to laughing, devote time to mourning, devote time to celebrating. Because what we are meant to do is to embrace feelings of grief, reckon with them, have the courage to feel them, to feel sad and to feel depressed, so that we can then integrate them into our lives. There is a time and there is a space for difficult feelings of grief. It's not that we tolerate them, but that we see that experience as necessary in our lives. You know, there is a collective sense of grief right now. There's a collective sense of loss. The world we know is no longer. And I was listening to a podcast by one of the great teachers of psychology, of social work. Her name is Brene Brown. She's written many books, bestsellers, and she's done a lot of wonderful research. And I was listening to a podcast of hers, and she says, you know what it's going to be like? Remember, you know, we tell ourselves that, you know, we remember what air travel was like before 9/11 and what air travel was like after 9/11, right? It's a moment in which the world changed. And airport security and travel became very different after 9/11. And so Brene Brown says that we're going to be talking about this period of time in the same way. The world before the pandemic and the world after the pandemic. And the most important thing to realize is that we are grieving. We are grieving a world, a normalcy that we no longer have. And that impacts all of us in the world, all of us on this Zoom session in different ways, unique to our various situations. The pandemic won't be forever. I'm sure. I'm not like a Pollyannish optimist, but I'm confident that there will be a time when we won't be dealing with this. But the world will be different in some ways, because it will be after a time in which we've experienced loss, whether it's loss of loved ones, loss of friends, loss of people we know, or the loss of gathering together, for meals, for events, for life cycle celebrations, the loss of gathering together in worship. We need to name it, Brene Brown says, so that we can feel it. And that's what it means to demonstrate acceptance, to find meaning in our loss. We need to name our loss. We need to name our grief so that we can feel it, because we need to feel it in order to integrate it into our lives. I'm sure there are people on this call who are being told, by their kids or by their loved ones, don't go out. Stay home. Stay home for your safety. Don't go to ShopRite. Don't go to this store. Don't go to that store. And that's a loss. And I'm sure many of us are complaining about not being able to do these things. And I'm sure, take for an example, someone with grown children. I have lots of conversations. My mother lives in Israel. My father lives in Chicago. And we have lots of conversations about what me and my siblings think my parents should be doing and should not be doing. And that's terribly difficult for them. It's difficult for us, but it's more difficult for them. And the disconnect, the reason why the conversations are difficult is because from our perspective, from my perspective, we're trying to keep our parents alive. We're trying to keep them safe. We're trying to keep them healthy. But what we also have to recognize is that no matter how much it's for our own good, it's still a loss. It's still a loss not to be able to do these normal things that we do when things were normal. No matter what we do for our safety and for our health, we must recognize that there is a loss of normalcy that must be grieved. It must be grieved in order to reckon with it. And guess what? If you're thinking to yourself right now, you know what, my loss is trivial compared to somebody else's loss. I know someone who lost a loved one. Me not being able to go to ShopRite, that's everyone's loss is personal. And David Kessler, the co-author of the book on grief and grieving, he had the most amazing quote. He said, "The worst loss is always your loss." And so, some losses are more tragic than others, but in my own sphere of existence, what is a loss to me is a loss to me. And so maybe I don't share it with someone who's going through a tougher time than I am, but I can share it with somebody else because that loss is personal to me. And we've been talking a lot about grief and grieving, and I just want to add one element to the concept of grief and grieving, because David Kessler also talks about something called anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is the expectation that we are entering into a world that is more difficult or more uncertain. And the reason it's anticipatory is because it's not September yet, it's not October yet, but we're already worried about September and October. We're already worried about, will there be another spike in the fall? That's anticipatory grief, and that's grief in and of itself. So I just wanted to add that to our understanding of the different kinds of grief. But I do want to end on sort of a practical note. And that is, what do we do with this deeper understanding of grief and loss and the need to embrace it, not to avoid it? The only way around is through. So here are just some practical ideas. These are not recommendations, but some of them are recommendations. Some of them are just thoughts. But here are some concrete ideas that I want to leave you with. First of all, there's a time for everything, like it says in Ecclesiastes, like it says in Koheles. And what that means is that we have to be able to hold different emotions at the same time. We have to be able to experience grief and loss, even if we happen to be enjoying, something else that we're going on. We're watching TV, we're having a great lunch, whatever it is. We can hold different emotions at the same time. That's number one. Number two, so critical that people have self-compassion. It's okay to feel grief. It's okay to feel unhappy, grumpy, moody, stressed. My wife and I have been more stressed in the last few months than ever before in the different roles that we play. And one of the things that we're trying to do is trying to talk to each other more and more and just give voice to the stresses that we're feeling. Because it's okay to feel stress. It's how we cope with that stress that's important. Talking to others, externalizing a person's sense of grief is so important. Complaining is very, very important. And this is a rabbi talking to you. I spend my life listening to people complain. But it's important to complain because you need to externalize. You need to talk out the things that are bothering you. And you need to find people who know how to listen to your complaints without trying to solve them. Because many of the complaints that we have don't have a solution that doesn't involve a magic wand. Some of the realities we're dealing with are not going away. They're not going away soon, but we need to be able to complain about them. And that's another way of just sitting with one's grief. Brene Brown mentioned something so beautiful. She said, we need to find ways to ritually support each other. Ritually support each other. There are ways in which we support each other. We reach out, we connect, we offer to do favors, whatever it is. We need to find ways to ritualize that. If we have a friend that we talk to a lot or every so often, maybe we need to set a time, a particular time that we're going to talk every week, or we're going to have a certain dialogue, or I'm going to do something comforting, whether it's gardening or something, ritualized so that I have that sense of structure, that I know that I have these things, baked into my calendar, so that I know I can rely, I can count on them being there. And then finally, the last concrete point that I want to make, and this comes from Viktor Frankl, and that sense of meaning and finding meaning. I'm sure there are some of you on this call who have far more life experience than I do, and people of my generation or younger. I'm sure there are people on this call who remember a world with far less technology, far less control over our surroundings. I think for people who remember a very different world than we live in today, I would ask you to draw upon your experiences to educate us, the young who are ignorant of the struggles of previous years. When it was during one of the hurricanes there were gas shortage and it was hard to get gas, right? I don't know what year exactly the gas shortages of the 1970s were, but I either was not born yet or I was a toddler. I don't remember exactly when they were, but we have no sense of not having gas. And those few days during a hurricane was like the whole world was falling apart, or having a power outage or things like that. People with more life experience are able to help those of us with less life experience understand what it means to have less control over our world. People experience grief in all sorts of different ways, I don't want to repeat myself, but to summarize, I would just say that I know for some people it could sound a little bit fluffy to say, oh, you have to give yourself permission to grieve. You have to make space for your grief. But those are actually very real concepts, because our tendency, like our default mode of operating when it comes to just dealing with all the stresses of life, is to just plow ahead and to move through it and to put things aside. But if there's one thing that Joseph teaches us from that moment that he paused before revealing himself, is that we have to sit with those feelings of grief in order to cope, in order to integrate them into our lives, and for us to be able to thrive with so much uncertainty surrounding us. Thank you all for participating. I'm gonna unspotlight my video, and if anybody wants to ask any questions or anything, I'm happy to take any questions. Carol Leslie is clapping. Thank you.
So Avi has sent you something in the chat box.
Okay.
About Yosef and the tears of joy, if you wanted to reply to
Oh,
that.
yes. Yeah. It could be, you're right. It could be, Avi wrote that it can be argued that the tears that Joseph had were tears of joy and not grief, that he's forgotten the pain, that he's happy to be back with his family. Avi's going to give the next class, and he's going to give you a different view of Joseph. Okay.
Rabbi, thank you very much. This was not an easy topic, and you really handled it beautifully.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. All right. Thank you all so much for joining. Have a great day.
Thank
If
you.
anybody ever wants to talk or anything, Esther knows where to reach me. So does Avi. All right, take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Um,
Bye.
Stay healthy, everyone. Bye.